Hello students! In today's video, which is dedicated for advanced players as well, we will learn how to play against the Benoni defense with the white pieces. I will introduce you to all the main plans and ideas, as well as the move orders. At first, let's see how do we get to the Benoni defense. White starts the game with d4, black plays knight f6, or sometimes they could also start with c5, white plays c4, and black plays c5. To be honest, I think that the only way to some kind of tangible advantage for white in this position is to push the pawn and claim space. b5 would be leading to one of the best gambits in chess for the black pieces that we call the Penko gambit, and the Benoni starts with e6. White plays natural moves, knight to c3, takes and takes, then they play pawn to d6, and after e4 we have normal classical Benoni defense. Let's take a moment to learn more about the pawn structure of Benoni and cover all plans for both sides before we move to look at concrete moves. First of all, I want to say that it's a very dynamic opening, full of tactical opportunities for actually both sides. White has pawn majority on the king side. As you can see here, we have 4 against 3, while black has queen side majority. And so more natural plans for white is to actually push on the right side of the board due to that majority, and more natural or common plan for black would be pushing on the left side or the so-called queen side. However, sometimes players change these directions, and you could see games where white plays on the left and black plays on the right. It's important to know that white has space advantage due to the pawn on d5, and so piece exchanges favor black. Black has also the so-called outside majority, 3 against 2 on the outside. And a lot of the times, this gives outside pass pawn opportunities for the black pieces, and therefore that is considered to be strength in the endgame. Therefore, endgame in Benoni is generally better for black if everything else is equal. White typically tries to play for the e4-e5 break, and sometimes that includes the f-pawn, which could be supporting the break by moving the f-pawn to f4. Sometimes white opts for play on the queen side, which would be including b4, especially if we move something like rook to b1, black's pawn is on b5, we get to pawn to b4 in order to cramp the black's queen side, and even though black would be getting the so-called protected pass pawn, if that is sufficiently blocked by our piece, like something like the knight on c3, we sometimes achieve a successful blockade on the left side of the board and could pursue the king side on the right side of the board. So this idea of rook b1 and b4 is not completely rare, but let's just say that more often than not, white is not including that. Black typically tries to play for the a6 b5 break, because I say break because a lot of times the white's pawn is going to be on a4, and sometimes they play on the king side, and moves would include f5, sometimes even g5, g4, especially to stop the expansion of the white's pawn to f4, and if white ends up with something like the knight on g3, sometimes even the h pawn is thrown at the pony on g3. So these are general ideas. Now let's come back to our position. There are many ways to play Benoni for white and black. Black almost always, I believe, at your level is going to opt for the main line, which is to fianchetto the bishop. I believe that is the best objectively way to play with the black pieces. And here white has many different ways of playing. What I will recommend is the classical main line, which starts with knight to f3, very classical development. And I think that moves are going to be very natural. Bishop to g7, and we simply move the bishop to e2. Black here is going to castle, white castles, and we have a first branch where black has a choice. Some moves are going to be coalescing into the same line. We call them transpositions in chess. But over here, black perhaps has 2 different ways of playing. One would be including a6, and the other one would be first starting with rook to e8. Now, after rook to e8, I have to say that one of the most common plans for white, or rather maneuvers in Benoni, is placing this knight from f3 and moving it to the square c4 in order to exert more pressure on d6. A lot of times that could also be supported by the f4 pawn. Now, as I have mentioned, white tries to keep as many pieces on the board, and also this knight maneuver could sometimes be preparing the f-pawn thrust forward, which would give extra support for our dream break, eventually e5. So here we're going to play knight d2. If they play without a6, let's say they could play knight d7. White plays almost always the move a4. It just makes it harder for black later to carry out the break b5. For example, knight to e5. Here we have another idea, rook to a3 thanks to the pawn on a4, and this rook indirectly is always going to find itself activity on the third rank. Later it could be even switched to the king side. Very often in order to stop f4, black is going to be playing g5, and after a move like queen to c2, there's this typically weakened square on f5 that white could be trying to capitalize on by moving one of the knights to f5 square. This is not a Benoni thing, but in many openings, when black is playing g5, we claim this f5 square as a weakness, and we try to progress with the knight to that square eventually. So some games have continued with g4, white could start the maneuver opening up the rook as well along the third rank, and for example, knight h5, a little bit inaccurate move, was played in a few grandmaster games. f4 takes and knight takes, and I believe that white has huge kingside attacking potential with ideas like knight to e5, discovering the attack on the knight on h5, followed by moves like bishop f4 or bishop g5. The rook soon is going to switch to the king side as well, and our knight will quickly come into the game with the move knight to f2. White is here almost winning objectively. Now let's go back. And let's go back to the move that I think you're going to be seeing the most. In this position, a6 at your level is going to be a little bit more popular than rook to e8. After a6, we almost always stop black's idea of playing b5. As you saw previously, sometimes that move is played even without the inclusion of a6. And the most logical for black here is the move bishop g4, which is an attempt to alleviate the lack of space problem by exchanging one pair of pieces, specifically the bishop on g4 for the knight on f3. For this reason, since they do want to trade, it makes no sense for us to waste a tempo on inducing something that they want to do anyways, and we're just going to be playing the move bishop f4. This move is applying the pressure on d6 and prevents black from developing the last minor piece into the game because we're attacking the pawn on d6. In this position, usually players take on f3, but we could also take a look at the move rook to e8. White can play knight to d2 to try to move the knight to c4, where we will apply more pressure on d6. For example, bishop takes e2, queen takes e2. White is intending to play knight c4. Therefore, black plays knight h5 to kick away the white's bishop from this diagonal. Knight to d7 after bishop e3 now can't be played because we no longer apply the pressure on d6. And for example, g4, kicking away the knight to f6. If you're afraid of your king, don't. You have dominance over the center and the center is closed. White's king is absolutely safe. Black's knight, for example, goes back. And after f3, black is somewhat paralyzed. From here on, white can improve their position with moves like bishop to f4. If we can, we're going to be playing for move knight to c4. But likely after bishop f4, they're going to be playing knight to e5 in order to not allow us to exert more pressure with a knight to c4. So imagine bishop goes to f4, we can keep improving our position with something like a5, which makes it harder to carry out the break b5, as after we take en passant, after b5, we can take a look at the weak pawn on a6, and even this knight from c3 can later be transposing to c4, where we will have two knights aiming at c4, and this way we'll be even applying more pressure on the square d6. So let me just show you that evolution of the position. I told you many things. So let's say knight e5. I'm just wasting time for black as I want to show you how white can improve their position. Something like king h1 could be included. And imagine something like that would be a decent plan here to keep in mind. As we go back over here, rook to e8 is one direction. Another direction is simply to trade on f3 right away. Bishop will take back. Queen to e7 is a typical move. This is the idea of overprotecting e5. It allows the knight now come to d7, as well as exerting some pressure on e4 and e5, since on the last move already, white was perhaps ready to strike with the move e5. Rook to e1, and after knight bd7, I prepared almost novelty. There was like 1 or 2 games played out of 300 grandmaster games that I found in this position, and I saw that a lot of the times black players prepare this rook b8, b5. So if we play a5, there are hundreds of games after rook b8 and b5. And the new move here that I suggest is bishop to e2. It simply is an attempt to stop or at least put more pressure on the point b5. Later we will move the bishop to f1 in order to keep the rook opened. And black, if they take on e4, they get quite a bad endgame where white has 2 bishops. So for example, this is the computer line, knight e4, takes and takes, bishop takes d6 since the queen was deflected, rook to e8, bishop to g4, attacking the knight, and for example, take, take, take. And I think that white has good chances here to play for a win. For instance, knight f6 and bishop f3. We're threatening c5. So there's a pass pawn, and I think most importantly, 2 bishops. And if you're a very technical player, I believe that you could squeeze out something out of white's position over here. So this bishop e2 will be, say, a new spice for you if you're intending to play my repertoire against the Benoni. And I just want to mention that rook e8 is an alternative. Here, I prepared queen to d2, connecting the rooks. And if you need a plan, I suggest something like bishop f1, opening up the rook. Then we could play for ideas like h3, perhaps bishop back to h2, and slowly preparing f4. So let me show you like possible evolution of white's position. Like something like this, I think, would be a plan. If they play something dynamically, as always in any opening, we may need to change the way we play this. So I didn't cover absolutely everything because it's literally impossible. Thank you for watching. Consider hiring me as your personal online chess coach if you liked the video, and see you in the next lesson. Bye-bye.